By the time the winter winds settled over the Russian steppes, the Grande Armée was no longer an army. It was a graveyard stretching for miles. Frozen cannons sat useless in the snow, and the pride of the French Empire lay buried beneath the ice. 6 months earlier, Napoleon Bonaparte had marched nearly 600,000 men across the border, the greatest military force the world had ever seen. But now, less than 1 in 6 would ever see France again. They were not defeated by a superior strategy. They were not outfought on the battlefield. They were destroyed by a single refusal to turn back. History remembers him as the man who conquered Europe. But on this frozen road, he learned a brutal lesson. He could conquer the world, but he could not conquer his own ego. Welcome to our channel where we break down power, decisions, and consequences. If you want to understand how leaders rise and why they fall, subscribe, because history doesn't repeat itself, but decisions do. To understand the magnitude of the fall, you have to stand at the summit. By 1811, Napoleon Bonaparte wasn't just a ruler. He was the master of the continent. From the borders of Russia to the coast of France, kings kept their crowns only because he allowed them to. The chaos of the French Revolution was a distant memory, replaced by the iron will of an emperor who seemed incapable of failure. He had stared down the ancient monarchies of Austria and Prussia, and he had brought them all to heel. His dominance was built on a formula that was terrifyingly effective. Napoleon didn't believe in long, slow wars. He believed in the lightning strike. His strategy was to move faster than his enemies thought possible, force them into one massive, decisive battle, and break their army in a single afternoon. It worked at Austerlitz. It worked at Jena. It became his addiction. He began to believe that war was simply a mathematical equation he had solved, but this absolute dominance created a dangerous blind spot. When you have never known defeat, caution starts to look like cowardice. He was convinced that he could end any conflict with one brilliant day of violence, unaware that he was about to enter a war where battles wouldn't matter at all. The cracks began to show in the East, born from a friendship turned cold. Tsar Alexander III, once an admirer of the French emperor, decided he could no longer suffocate his own economy to satisfy Napoleon's feud with Great Britain. He opened Russian ports to British trade, effectively shattering the continental system, the economic blockade Napoleon had designed to bring England to its knees. To Napoleon, this wasn't just a change in policy, it was a direct challenge to his authority. It was a loose thread that, if pulled, could unravel the entire tapestry of his empire. He believed that if Russia could defy him without consequence, every other conquered nation would soon follow suit. Convinced that he had to make an example of the Tsar, Napoleon didn't just call up the reserves, he drained the continent. He assembled a force that defied imagination, a Grande Armée of over 600,000 men. It was a moving city of soldiers drawn from every corner of his domain. Italians, Germans, Poles, and Frenchmen, all marching under one banner. It was a force so massive the ground seemed to shake beneath its feet, an army designed to terrify the world into submission before a single shot was fired. But in gathering such a colossal host, Napoleon was unknowingly building a beast too large to feed and too slow to maneuver. He was preparing for the war he wanted to fight, blinding himself to the strategic trap that was already closing around him. The tragedy of 1812 is not that Napoleon marched into the unknown, but that he marched into the known and chose to ignore it. Inside his inner circle, the voices of caution were loud and desperate. Armand de Caulaincourt, his master of horse and former ambassador to Russia, pleaded with him to reconsider. He warned the emperor that Alexander would not surrender like the other monarchs, and that the sheer geography of Russia was a weapon no army could defeat. The logistics alone were a nightmare. Feeding 500,000 men and thousands of horses in a desolate wasteland where roads were non-existent and harvests were sparse was not a military maneuver, it was a suicide pact. But the emperor had stopped listening to logic. He was listening to his own legend. He dismissed the maps and the math, waving away their fears with a terrifying arrogance. He told his generals that the campaign would be short, convinced that he could force the Russians to fight early. One good battle, he promised, will end it. He was betting everything on a quick victory, unaware that his enemy had no intention of giving him the one thing he needed to win. In June 1812, the endless columns of the Grande Armée surged across the Niemen River, a river of steel flooding into the Russian Empire. Napoleon stood on the bank, expecting to see the Russian army lined up to stop him, ready for the glorious clash he had predicted. Instead, he found nothing but silence. The Russian commander, Barclay de Tolly, understood that he could not defeat Napoleon in a fair fight, so he chose not to give him one. He initiated a strategy of ruthless pragmatism, ordering his forces to retreat and burn everything in their wake. Every farmhouse, every field of grain, and every bridge was torched, leaving the French nothing but ash and scorched earth to sustain them. Napoleon found himself chasing ghosts, pushing his men deeper into a blackened wasteland in pursuit of a battle that kept moving further away. Long before the first flake of snow ever fell, the Grande Armée began to rot from the inside. The summer heat was suffocating, turning the dust of the road into choking clouds, while typhus and dysentery swept through the ranks like a plague. Horses died by the thousands from exhaustion, and men dropped dead in the ditches without ever seeing an enemy soldier. It was a phantom war, a silent slaughter that stripped the army of its strength mile by agonizing mile. Yet the emperor pressed on, convinced that if he just marched far enough, the enemy would have to turn and fight. Finally, 70 miles west of Moscow, the retreat ended. The Russians had appointed a new commander, the wily veteran Mikhail Kutuzov, who finally turned to face them at Borodino. He offered Napoleon the conflict he had craved for months, but the result was not the masterpiece the emperor expected. It was a chaotic meat grinder, a day of savage, unrefined violence, where strategy was replaced by sheer attrition. Cannonballs plowed through dense columns of men, turning the battlefield into a river of blood and screaming metal. By nightfall, 70,000 men lay dead or dying, marking the single bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars. Technically, the French held the field, but it was a hollow triumph, a Pyrrhic victory that broke the spirit of his army without breaking the resolve of his enemy. Kutuzov simply withdrew again, leaving Napoleon with a battered force and a dangerous delusion. He looked toward the spires of Moscow and convinced himself that seizing the capital would mean the end of the war, clinging to the old rules of conquest, while his exhausted soldiers looked at the piles of their dead comrades and felt only a deep, creeping dread that the worst was yet to come. When the emperor finally rode through the gates of Moscow, he expected the boyars to be kneeling in the dust, offering him the keys to the city on a velvet cushion. It was the ritual of conquest he had performed in Vienna and Berlin, the moment where the enemy acknowledged his mastery. Instead, he found only silence. The streets were deserted, the houses abandoned, and the grand palaces stripped bare. There was no surrender, only the echoing footsteps of his confused soldiers wandering through a ghost town. Then, the first wisps of smoke began to curl into the sky. In an act of defiance that shattered Napoleon's understanding of warfare, the Russians had set their own holy city ablaze, rather than let it support his army. Moscow became an inferno that turned the night sky into blood, forcing the French to watch in horror as their prize consumed itself. Yet, even as the city burned, Napoleon refused to leave. He took residence in the Kremlin, paralyzed by a fatal mixture of arrogance and denial. He sat in the Tsar's own chair and waited for a peace letter that would never arrive, convinced that Alexander would come to his senses and beg for terms. For 35 agonizing days, he lingered in the charred ruins, writing letters that went unanswered and staring out at the desolate horizon. He was waiting for a political victory, while the physical reality of his situation deteriorated around him. He had captured a capital of ash, and in his hesitation, he had wasted the last precious weeks of autumn. By the time he finally accepted the silence as an answer and gave the order to pack up, the first frost was already forming on the window panes, and the trap had snapped shut. The order to turn back finally came, but it was a death sentence signed in delay. As the Grande Armée limped back toward the west, the true enemy revealed itself, merciless and inescapable. They called him General Winter, and his assault was absolute. The temperature plunged to 30 degrees below zero, turning the air into ice and the ground into iron. Soldiers who had conquered Italy and Egypt found themselves freezing to death while they walked, their limbs turning black and useless before they even realized they were dying. The discipline that had once terrified Europe dissolved into a feral struggle for survival. Food became a distant memory, and the desperation drove men to madness. Starving soldiers fought over the carcasses of fallen horses, gnawed on leather boots to trick their stomachs, and in the darkest, most desperate nights, whispered rumors of cannibalism spread through the shivering ranks. But the final cruelty came at the Berezina River. A sudden thaw turned the ice into a rushing torrent of deadly water, cutting off their escape with Russian armies closing in. French engineers had to stand in the freezing river to build bridges, sacrificing their lives to save the remnants of the army. Those who crossed lived to suffer another day. Those who didn't were lost forever. It was no longer an army. It was a massacre of ghosts stumbling blindly through the white hell of their emperor's making. With the remnants of his army still stumbling toward the border, Napoleon made one final cold calculation. He realized that if he stayed to suffer with his men, his government in Paris might fall to a coup, so he chose his crown over his soldiers. In the dead of night, the emperor abandoned the frozen wasteland, racing back to the capital in a sleigh while leaving his troops to fight for survival behind him. When he arrived in Paris, he famously declared that his health had never been better, a statement that rang with sickening irony against the backdrop of 500,000 dead. But the damage went far deeper than the loss of manpower. The spell was finally broken. For a decade, Europe had been paralyzed by the myth of Napoleon's invincibility. But now the world saw that the god could bleed. The kings and emperors he had bullied into submission saw their chance. Prussia and Austria, once forced allies, soon turned their guns west, joining Russia in a massive coalition to hunt him down. The hunter became the prey. Despite raising a new army and fighting brilliantly for another year, Napoleon could not stop the avalanche he had triggered. The war came to French soil, and his own marshals, weary of endless conflict, eventually refused to fight. They forced the man who had once owned Europe to sign his own defeat and accept a humiliating exile, watching his empire crumble into dust just 2 years after he had marched it into the snow. There would be an encore, of course, a daring escape from exile, and one last gamble at a place called Waterloo. But that was just the aftershock of the earthquake. The true end had already happened on the road to Moscow. Waterloo was merely the final punctuation mark on a sentence written in the Russian snow. The man who died on the lonely rock of St. Helena 6 years later was not defeated by the Duke of Wellington or the British Navy. He was defeated by the memory of 1812. In his final days, staring out at the endless Atlantic Ocean, Napoleon remained trapped in the prison of his own past, endlessly replaying the moment he chose pride over prudence. His story remains history's most brutal warning to those who seek absolute control. It teaches us that genius is no shield against hubris, and that while a man can conquer nations, laws, and armies, he is never more vulnerable than the moment he starts to believe he is unstoppable. The empire did not fall because it was weak. It fell because its master forgot that even emperors can freeze. Power doesn't destroy leaders. Certainty does. Napoleon believed success made him untouchable. History proved otherwise. This channel studies power, decisions, and consequences. If you want to understand how leaders fall before they realize it themselves, subscribe.